because again, many entities don't move forward because they're resistive to change because they fear some aspect of it. But ultimately, change is happening whether you want it to or not.
Welcome to the Stakeholder Impact Forum, a platform by Casaris, exploring how member and purpose-driven organisations can drive real change through stakeholder engagement, community building, and measurable impact. Today we're joined by Matt Hunter, an innovator and ecosystem builder with over 30 years of experience in aligning diverse stakeholders around shared visions of economic growth through innovation and entrepreneurship. In this interview, you'll discover why thriving organisations think in terms of ecosystems, how storytelling and shared vision can inspire diverse stakeholders to engage, why the most effective organisations widen their stakeholder net to include unexpected voices, and explore practical strategies for engagement in uncertain times, from peer-to-peer support to experimenting at the edges.
Matt, thank you so much for joining us today. And really excited to hear everything. I think you've had a really interesting journey in everything to do with member organizations. I want to touch on something that you'd say you're an ecosystem builder. And I want to just start there. Like, what does that mean to you? And what does that mean to kind of member organizations?
Yeah, well, I suppose I've been very lucky always to be in the world of innovation. I was trained as a designer, both sort of physical and digital, and I ended up in California working for a company called IDEO. And what was remarkable about them at the time in the mid-90s was that they believed fundamentally in collaboration. We need mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, product designers, interaction designers, if I might say, and then eventually sort of business designers, people thinking about business models. And ultimately, we built a culture, or I was part of a culture and part of building a culture that was highly collaborative. So the ecosystem in that sense, I suppose I didn't think about ecosystems then, but I did think about innovation and collaboration. But it was mostly we, IDEO, the sort of interesting multidisciplinary consultancy, and a client. But then I moved essentially to work for government, to an entity called the Design Council. And of course, government is very interested in bringing together and convening sort of the best of the talents. And so then fundamentally, it wasn't so bilateral. It was about me and government and business and community groups and all of these things. And then I began to see, okay, now it's a different type of collaboration with not just multiple disciplines, but multiple organizations. And then most recently, I've been involved, I suppose, in innovation in physical places. And then actually it's a very similar group of people, universities and businesses and governments and all the rest of it. But I suppose, why do I think about it as ecosystem? Because I suppose it's something that evolves over time and has to endure for a very long time. And you have to think of it as this very dynamic organization, because compared with right at the beginning, this bilateral thing, it felt like there's more complexity and more change. And so you've just got to reflect on the fact it's a bit more complex to manage, and therefore it's worth using a word like ecosystem rather than just a sort of a collaborative project.
Absolutely. So when you kind of focus on an ecosystem, whether, as you say, it's an organization, governmental, or a literal physical space, when you're approaching that kind of stakeholder collaboration, that kind of bringing everyone together, those collaborative innovation ecosystems, how are you approaching that, and has that changed over time since you got into it with that was early?
Yes, well, I think it has. And so absolutely, I think in the early days at IDEO, we'd have called it a brief. You, the client, have asked us to help you solve a thing. Now, don't get me wrong, defining the brief, and we'll come on to this, is a very, very important thing, because a brief in some ways is the statement of maybe a problem you're trying to solve, but also a hint about how you're going to fix it, what the opportunity is, and maybe what your cunning plan is for fixing something. So a brief was really important for that project-based bilateral relationship. But when I was at the Design Council, what we were doing, in fact, is our mission at the Design Council was to get more people to use design. So I could have given speeches that said, design is very important. You need to do more with it, And it had been proven very well, actually, in the 20th century. So the late 20th century, second half of the 20th century, the Design Council had been supremely effective in getting UK industry to design things more successfully for consumers. So a lot of the housewares and between cars and clothing and housewares and all the rest of it. It really helped industry to be successful commercially,
Yeah.
I suppose. And now the challenge was different. We were saying, well, okay, industry gets designed, but actually public services doesn't. We think that better designed, more intentional, more human-centered public services will be the next goal. So that was our goal. But of course, you can't just say to government, you need to use us. It's a bit sort of boring. So instead we said, well, what does government care about? Well, government cares about many problems within public services. It could be awful things like violence against staff in hospitals, sort of physical and verbal violence. It could be infections. It could be the problem of healthy aging. Health systems are being overrun partly because we're all getting older, living for longer, and having more chronic conditions. So how do we think cleverly about the brief? So this is the vision, the framing. And so, of course, what we would do is go to government by saying, let us help you build more of a vision about what it is to live healthily, to age healthily. We're going to use a design method for that. Don't worry about it, but it's going to be amazing. It's going to be tangible. And so ultimately it's about reframing what success looks like. And now we might call it a vision or something rather than a brief. And this shared vision would draw things through. So I think ultimately it is about listening to everyone, to seeing how they frame, how they understand the world and what they want to get done. But coming up with a big vision, I think that draws people together. I mean, a particular example I'm interested in at the moment, I suppose, is I think it's called the Move to -15. So what this is a low carbon initiative of the food industry. But rather than just say, let's reduce the carbon within the food industry, they're saying, we found a particular issue where at the moment the sort of frozen food is moved around the world at -18 degrees. This is an abstract constraint. There's no reason for it to be -18. We've got scientific evidence that says 3 degrees warmer would not let the bacteria grow any faster. So we're going to make this mission, and it's called the Move to -15, and this will be the call to action. So I think it's how you sort of create this vision, or let's call it a call to action, one better, I think.
Well, the story
is really important. So I think that's the way it all works, is you've really got to serve up on a plate much more this thing that will get everyone excited. You can't just expect them to be interested in what interests you.
Well, it's telling the story, isn't it? It's making the people that are part of the ecosystem aware of, firstly, as you say, what's the call to action, but secondly, why? Why are they doing? What value are they getting from that? What's the impact on them as stakeholders, members? And I think a really interesting point there of the -15 thing. And are there any kind of initiatives that you've seen work at the Design Council that really have kind of brought those people together, effective in, and as you said, it's quite diverse stakeholders. It's government, it's NGOs, it's faculty, it's whatever.
Yes. Yeah, well, let me give you an example. So one of the programs that I led was living well with dementia. So we know that as we grow older, the incidence of dementia will increase. And yet we don't effectively, or at least we didn't back in 2010, 2015, have cures. And now we're beginning perhaps to get sort of cures, but still we're some way off. So in other words, we're living with dementia, and it's an awful progressive disease, and ultimately we and the people who care for us need to be better supported to make daily life and our kind of, unfortunately, our sort of degeneration with the disease as livable as possible, to have high quality of life. So with that, I think what's really important is you're saying, okay, yes, we know that the Department of Health is interested. We know that the Alzheimer's Society is interested, but actually there's a huge other bunch of people that could be interested. So I think not only was it about framing living well with dementia, and I'll come on to sort of how we described it, but actually being open to the idea that the stakeholders may not be the stakeholders that are most obvious. And I think being really open about inviting new people in brings new energy, new ideas, and all the rest of it. So I think one of the things we might come back to is the idea that my stakeholder group should not be too fixed. I think allowing that to be a little bit sort of broader is good. And so you can really put out an open call with this vision. Even if this vision is a little fuzzy, we want to help people live better with dementia. Do you have ideas? At times you can be quite open and engage people just to sort of bring ideas. But then what we did was we said we want to fund startups. Those startups might be charities or social enterprises, or they might be for-profit entities. For instance, one of the if I name two, one was a bunch of designers and engineers and fragrance experts who recognized that malnutrition was a big problem with dementia, because people lose interest in food because actually they lose the ability to smell. And so therefore making a bit of a kind of food smells alarm clock that would go off just before meal times would subconsciously cause people to become more interested in food, and not only increase the range of foods that they ate, but their appetite. And so they were creating a device that might live in a care home that was for some amazing kind of food smells augmenter, or sort of appetite augmenter. There's another group that we seed funded, which was a group of students from Glasgow School of Arts who were doing a project on dementia. And they imagined a sort of assistive dog service. And they got together with Alzheimer's Scotland and Dogs for the Disabled and made a assistive dog service that still exists to this day. So there we go, thinking, well, who are the stakeholders that might help me to push forward in the world of dementia? Who thought of all those crazy fragrance experts and art school students? And then finally, I'd say, not only about that sort of being open, but the tangibility. One of the things, of course, that was always one of the secret weapons of design was not only this interest in real life and sort of ethnography and so the use of social science, but the ability to hold something up, be it a drawing or a physical prototype, and say, look, this is what the future will look like. Even if it's going to take me another 2 years or so to implement this thing, here is a concept. And so this idea of making progress tangible as soon as possible, I think, was great. So between those things of frame the problem really excitingly, be open about how you draw people in, and then try to make progress as tangible as possible, especially in the early stages, just to give people belief that this isn't just a talking shop. Those are some of the things I think we've always put into practice and I think are quite widely applicable.
It's a really interesting point of, how you widen that stakeholder net. Was there any thinking behind that of where you put the outreach to, and how do you see maybe a more traditional member organization who does have that defined subset of members are our stakeholders, even though we all know that they have a much wider ecosystem? How do you kind of go about finding those other ideas and stakeholders?
Yeah. Well, no, I think that's a really good point. And I should point out, I suppose, that while at the Design Council, we were very interested in bringing new entrants to a market. I mean, that's a sort of a classic theory that if you want to create innovation, bringing someone new in. I mean, let's face it, Apple was a computer company before they made phones or watches. Elon Musk was doing space rockets before he did cars, or the other way around. So new entrants to a market are incredibly important. And so therefore, if you truly are focused on innovation, do think about your stakeholders and maybe bringing more people into your membership. But I recognize that can not be appropriate in all cases. But when in the most recent kind of era of my sort of ecosystem building with +X Innovation, this place-based innovation hub, ultimately you are talking about a physically finite area. So by definition, the stakeholders are much more constrained than perhaps in some of my earlier systems. But when you're considering, let's say, in this context, a city such as Brighton with, I think it's circa 300,000 people and X number of significant institutions, 2 universities, 1 local government, et cetera, actually, it's thinking about still, even with a fixed stakeholder group or relatively fixed stakeholder group, some are kind of becoming more interested and some are becoming less interested. Some are more distracted, some are less distracted, some have got more resource, some have, So actually, even within, let's take the metaphor of a garden, even within a physical space, some plants are doing well and some aren't. So I think that, actually just still don't think of your stakeholder group as a sort of one-size-fits-all rigid thing. You've still got ebbs and flows within it, and actually seeking out maybe or spending more time with some of your stakeholders, which perhaps are feeling more distant from you, or were feeling less engaged. How might I engage them more? And vice versa, to sort of say, actually, if some stakeholder that's been very central for very good reason is sort of a bit less engaged at the moment, yes, of course, you ought to be thinking about how should I maintain the engagement. But actually, for a moment, they just need to go and be distracted elsewhere. Maybe that's okay. And I don't know how much that sort of phrasing fits with every situation, but I still think the ebb and the flow is something that we've experienced. And I think that you mustn't have too fixed an idea of who's most connected. And one of the things we found, I think, especially actually with all of these things, when trying to reach different parts of your constituency, is to be really clear about language.
Yeah.
We can easily be biased in particular forms of language. I mean, again, if we take the +X innovation geography definition of community, a local community, we've got such a diverse community there of from academics in universities to local charity groups. If we use the same language to the academics, the business academics and the local charity groups, everyone would be confused. So I think we would often, I learned this at the Design Council, really be very, very conscious of our language, not to turn off people. And I think to find inclusive language is incredibly important. And it may not be a one-size-fits-all bit of language. Maybe you're going to have to speak to different segments at different times, but be very conscious that actually, even within a fixed community, there's still ebbs and flows.
Yeah. I mean, we find it, even just asking the question, member, are you a member? Everyone has a different idea of if they're a member. Are they, in something like +X, which is a co-working space, having a desk is different to being a company in there, which is different to being everyone has a different idea of it. And even the word stakeholder, it's becoming much more widely used, but it does have its own connotations to it. So I suppose how do you, or have you seen solutions to kind of aligning people in a shared vision and showing them that, whatever organization it is beneficial to them, using that, that type of more universal language or other innovations around storytelling?
Yeah. So maybe if I sort of give you two examples. So from the Design Council, let's say we were doing a program once funded by a health foundation, not by government. And it was about a healthy childhood, essentially. It was about recognizing that the early years of childhood are phenomenally important for development. By the time you're age 3, your brain is, X% formed. I can't remember, but it's a very, very high percentage. And ultimately, anyone who's been a parent knows that those early years are really, really hard with these very, very demanding little people. And so both for the child and for the parent, or for the carer, usually the parent, the early years are really tough. What are the ways, are there kind of forms of grouping or service, again, charities that can particularly help this area? And so there you're talking again about a very wide range of people. And what we sort of said to everyone is, here's the singular challenge. We're not going to change our view that we've got sort of 3 types of things, getting out of the house can be a bit of a problem. How can you help us this? Or sort of, dental hygiene can be a problem for some groups. Or, we identified various, mental health for the parents. So we identified various challenges, but we said, look, you could have a lightweight involvement. You could just come and give us your opinions, or you could come and be a volunteer. Or you could sort of be the entrepreneur. You could come to us with an idea and maybe we'll seed fund you. So even within a community like that, we were quite fixed about what we wanted to achieve. But we said, here are the various ways in which you can be involved, depending on your level of interest and your level of sort of time commitment or whatever. So that was sort of one way in which we did it, to sort of be very conscious that one size didn't fit all in terms of contribution, but we were singular about what we wanted to do. With sort of +X innovation, I think sometimes it's a bit different, where we're saying, actually, we're going to have different types of activity as well. So sometimes people may be freelancers, and what they want to do is to sort of network, and therefore will have sometimes sort of fun, coffee or evening drinks or just talks that allow people to network. And what they want to do is sort of network, promote themselves. Maybe they want to be a speaker and they want to sort of show what they can do in the community. But if I'm running a 20 or 30 person team, I'm in quite a different position. And so therefore the general networking thing maybe isn't of interest to me. So what I want is maybe there's leaders circle, and that's a kind of peer-to-peer chief executive group where you help each other with what you perceive to be the more complex organizational problems. So in that context, one size doesn't fit all, even in terms of the vision, let alone the level of engagement. So I think in all cases, you've just got to understand both that sense of what are we shooting for? Do we have to have multiple definitions of success, multiple projects almost going on, multiple levels of activity? And what are the various ways in you can contribute? Can you contribute at a very sort of minor level if that's all you've got in terms of resource? And can you have more? And being aware that people often move up and down, I think it creates more resilient systems when you say, the whole thing won't fall apart if you don't turn up every week. Sometimes you just can't turn up every week, and maybe we can design a system where that's okay. So I think, again, resilient systems allow for that ebb and flow of interest and capacity. Yeah, those are some of the things we've done.
So, I mean, again, you're really preaching to, cater to diverse stakeholders, cater to diverse levels. And do you think there's a fundamental issue with the organizations, the institutions who are kind of wanting that ongoing, constant engagement and not understanding that, actually their members are diverse and will have diverse needs? And it's a bit like the LinkedIn algorithm, isn't it? If you just constantly want 50 likes on every post, but you're not understanding that. How do you think they can overcome that kind of challenge of themselves rather than their stakeholders?
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting question, because I think that fundamental to that, it's a bit like even what we see in this country around government being very centralized and recognizing it needs to decentralize. And there are many other countries that have done a much better job of that. And so I think something to do with centralization versus decentralization. So with centralization, you've got a central team who are dealing with myriad sort of people and capacities. It's overwhelming in terms of its complexity. And so therefore, the only way we can make sense of the world is to simplify it. And so we start putting things into boxes. And of course, the simplification makes our lives better. But now my various stakeholders have to sort of fit into boxes, maybe. And so there's a sense of trying to create a simple, reliable system, but maybe it's not possible. So what are the ways around that? Well, in theory, we might find that new technologies such as AI can help us to understand that. But there are older technologies as well. I mean, I think an awful lot of the World Wide Web and digital systems were actually about self-service. The idea was ultimately, if I can't get the service from the center, then I'm going to take control. I mean, the idea that I would go into a supermarket. The UK was one of the first places that went from this idea of, a shop where the assistant would be serving me to me putting things in a trolley and serving myself. And that was revolutionary. But it allowed me more quickly to move around this space with a very large variety of products and pick exactly what I wanted and get out. And so self-service, of course, has often been seen as this, at times when it goes wrong, a form of cost cutting. But actually, when it's done well, it's a great sense of empowerment. And so that's where, for instance, you might end up with peer-to-peer systems. And that's even more modern, I suppose, the idea of the sharing economy. And you might borrow my lawnmower because we've sort of shared it. Or I might sell you my lawnmower, even though I don't have a shop. So I think what we're seeing is more peer-to-peer. No, YouTube is a really interesting one, right? YouTube, this most phenomenal way of sharing information, has fundamentally disrupted the central media organizations. And so now many people are running, frankly, TV channels, and none of the major broadcasters are involved in it. And they've completely sucked, a lot of the advertising. So I think all of these sorts of platforms, and AI may be an example of this, are enabling, let's say, organizations that have had power at the center to distribute power and have more peer-to-peer and more kind of sharing of power. However, it is a scary thing to do that. In the world of innovation, it's called open innovation, where, that's what I was doing for government, is saying, you don't have to have all the answers. Some students from Glasgow School of Art might have the answers. Students from art school might have the answers for dementia. You must be crazy. Now, of course, we helped them to feel confident that you would have a mechanism to try that weird, risky thing. So I think this idea of letting go in some way, I mean, that's a high level word, but sort of ceding control or sharing control, using some of these digital and non-digital ways to engage in a more peer-to-peer outcome, rather than feeling that you at the center must control and must have all the answers. I think this has been a sort of an act of modernization that's been happening, but I think stakeholder organizations have to go on that journey, because that's a cultural shift, which is, it has downsides as well as upsides. I mean, you have to start sort of, it's a different sorts of governance, different sorts of risks about what could go wrong.
I think you hit on a really interesting point there around the challenges being faced, whether that's, kind of geopolitical uncertainty, the governmental, how governments are structured. And you mentioned there the kind of bigger players and the smaller peer-to-peer and the learning from grassroots. Do you think that there is a lesson to be learned in terms of specifically around member organizations, which are or have been predominantly older institutions, some of them hundreds of years old, that we're still almost looking to the top for what the direction is? And as you say, YouTube, AI, these new players that are, some of them less than 2 years old. And we've also got institutions, member organizations, things like Plus X, that are younger. And are we still kind of looking the wrong way for lessons? And how do you think, rather than finger pointing, how can we kind of collaborate and come together as a community to learn more and push membership forward?
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. And I think that there may be organizations, don't get me wrong, I think leadership, there's a great definition of leadership and management that I heard from Harvard Business Review, I think, which is very useful, which is leadership is often the thing that you have to do to get people through uncertain things. It's about sort of creating certainty in very ambiguous situations. And management often is about sort of operating things in much more known spaces. And I think we all need a very judicious mix of leadership and management. When are we trying to sort of carve through something ambiguous, and when are we really appropriately sort of managing the little cogs of a machine? In this context, I think there's no doubt that actually the center I've been determining, the hierarchy within the institution is powerful sometimes. Maybe there is a really ambiguous moment and they need to show leadership and say, look, everyone, if we made this a purely democratic thing, there'd be cacophony. We need to show direction here. The reason why, again, if we take political systems, in this country, we have elections every 5 years. Our leaders are supposed to give us a manifesto showing a direction of travel. And then we say, yep, okay, great, you're elected, over to you. So the relationship between the wider community and, in quotes, the leaders, don't get me wrong, I think that sort of hierarchy is important at times of confusion where you need to sort of show leadership. But there'll be other moments and other spaces where some collaboration might work. So I think you need a kind of a mixed economy in that way. And I think it is about experimenting, saying, okay, let's take this particular project. Let's see what we can do here. In the world of innovation, there's many, many examples of how organizations try out stuff. A really good example might be, how did Google start to get comfortable with AI? Because weirdly, even though many of the research papers that now have driven the large language models, and indeed Google being a major player of LLMs with Gemini, it wasn't always the way. And Google did have to, as I understand it, absorb sort of AI into its systems. And what they said is, okay, we're not going to get AI working on search, because search is the cash cow. It's the golden goose, right? To use a different animal metaphor. We're going to start somewhere different, maybe optimizing maps. Or of course it was language translation, and Google Translate. And ultimately in this context, therefore, if we're to try something peer-to-peer within a member organization with a slightly different governance model, let's not use it in a very big sort of central thing that we're very worried about. Let's try it at the edge. And so I do think there are many ways in which you can experiment with more collaborative systems to make them work. But exactly how the sort of the community, the stakeholders, and the sort of the leadership collaborate, I think is still, the opportunities are still slightly unclear. For instance, I'm a fellow of the Royal Society of the Arts, which is a multi-hundred-year-old sort of membership organization. And ultimately, there's a platform that they use called Circle, and it's actually it's an off-the-shelf thing. It's like a sort of customized Slack type entity. And I'm struck by a very wide range of views coming from the members in the terms of the open channels. You know, you might at times say cacophony, but it depends on your definition of how noisy you think this should be. But I don't have a good sense, even within this platform, of how these sparks of ideas and conversations might coalesce and then might turn into something. So I think I'm struck always in the way in which, maybe again, it's a slightly sort of evolutionary view, that ideas form because maybe people bounce ideas off one another, and then groups of people come together and they say, let's form this initiative and then let's turn this into something. So within my experience, let's say, of that particular organization, it still feels like the center is showing some great direction and framing things. And there's a sort of member chat over here, and they haven't always been connected. And I personally, it could be that I can't quite see it yet, and it does exist, but how ideas evolve and become, you know, maybe how early ideas are picked up by the saying, oh, that's interested. Do you want to form something? Should we do something together? Should we turn this into something formal? So how emergent conversations become formal initiatives. I would like to see more of that.
And you have your own experience of peer-to-peer learning with the Circularity Now campaign, which was praised for how it engaged stakeholders. So what are your learnings from that? And you mentioned there the amount of data that RIBA is getting. What did you see as the kind of key successes in building trust with the Circularity Now?
Circularity Now is very interesting in that it's ultimately, I suppose, it's initiative around the circular economy, the idea that material, so much of making physical things is linear, that we extract materials, we make things, and then we typically probably chuck them back in the ground again. And instead, what we need to do is not only at the end of life of a product, well, maybe extend the life of a product through maintenance and or use much more recycled material in the creation of the product in the first place, and ultimately see what we can do to extract less and put less into to essentially not reduce the waste streams and essentially keep material in play for a lot longer through many, many different methods. And so this is a very high level concept within environmental sustainability. And we knew this might be interesting, let's say, for instance, in our Brighton hub, because Plus6 Innovation has a huge history of innovation in physical innovation, so manufactured products. So, okay, it's stuff, not just digital bits. And then Brighton is, generally speaking, a community very interested in ethics and environmental sustainability. So therefore, you might imagine that circularity is a really good topic. And yet for quite some time, maybe years, when we were talking about, hey, let's do some initiatives, it felt that perhaps one of the universities already had an initiative that was a bit similar, or there wasn't obviously some money, or, just felt like there wasn't a departure point. And then suddenly we had a funded program that was about, novel forms of 3D printing, which theoretically is sort of part of this. But rather than just make a final sort of dissemination event for this project that sort of met the needs of the funding, the team said, let's make it bigger. Let's use this as an opportunity to sort of draw new people into the conversation. So they made a much bigger event. And I think, if I remember correctly, it was a rainy Wednesday evening where this event was or something. In other words, it wasn't the most auspicious day to get people into the building. But it turned out, people turned up. And so there was a bit of a kind of, ooh, this is good. More people turned up than we perhaps expected. We hoped for lots, but maybe we didn't get, okay, so listen to that signal. So you've been entrepreneurial in trying to take an opportunity and make more out of it. Listens to the reaction. You kind of, oh, there's something here. You brought new people into the conversation. And then you start to say, well, we don't have more funding to do this, but let's do another event. Let's do this around, I don't know, fashion. So then there was a one around circularity in fashion. You drew new people in. And it's happened a few times now. And each time the community has grown. The number of people that's turned up has grown. The sort of people have, because sometimes it takes a while for the word to spread. The local government that has circularity baked into its strategy, actually, is firmly engaged, and the universities may be kind of, oh, maybe you've got something slightly different from what we've got. So in other words, you just sort of, you get going, you're entrepreneurial, you draw new people in. It's the same thing that I've sort of spoken about before, but it kind of builds and it makes opportunity, and you find those new people and you suddenly go, right, now we know what to do. So often it's the case where you just have to do something, try it out, hopefully it works. And if it does, build on it and sort of duck and dive and weave and make something of it. But really, had we said, we're not doing anything until we find some funding, because it's going to take lots of money, we'd probably still be waiting. So in that sense, it's a classic bootstrapped entrepreneurial approach that I think now is creating the opportunity where funding might come to make it accelerate.
And do you think something like that, the curated live experiences, different topics, different interests, is that connecting with people more so than the kind of daily member to member, as you say, with River, you're getting this feedback in the new Slack app that you mentioned, but were you able to get more insights into your members at these kind of experiences, and did they help you to kind of overcome some of the, you mentioned earlier the leadership around uncertainty, and you've just said it yourself.
Yeah,
you wouldn't have
probably. Yeah, I think probably. I mean, I think it's a really good question about insights. I think so, but actually it's as much to do with energy. Many people know of a thing called a hackathon. A hackathon is a sort of getting together of people to sort of potentially solve a problem in, like, let's say 24 or 48 hours. Loads of people say that, look, hackathons don't solve problems, but what they do is help you understand a bit more about the problem you're trying to solve. And they certainly build a lot of social capital. And so they move you forward. And in this sense, I would say that an event is like that. It doesn't maybe reveal massive amounts of insight, but it kind of goes, you end, it's almost as simple as this. You end the go going, that was good. Wow, what a buzz in the room. What should we do next? Why no? Some people turn up. I've always wanted to do one about fashion. Yeah, all right. Why not? I've been fascinated over the years about how things happen. And when you want to make a decision to move forward, there are kind of two key questions. You either say, hey, why not? I feel like there's momentum. What could go wrong? You're biased to action and you say, hey, why not? As opposed to biased not to action. You go, why should we do that? And so therefore, I think with these events, you're biasing for energy and for action. You go, hey, let's give it a go. Can't be, and so I think with a lot of these things, you're getting insight, but you're actually getting energy and momentum. And I think with a lot of these systems, it's about the energy and the momentum and the trust and all of those things. And that somehow the insight, goes, but it's avoiding the leaning back and the analyzing saying, why would we do this? Because actually I think it was McKinsey that wrote a very good paper on this many years ago, 15 years ago. And they said, why does it always take so long to innovate in systems? And it takes so long because to innovate in a system, you've got to have the probability of this bit of the system going yes, this bit of the system. When you multiply all these probabilities together of X and Y and Z and A and B and C, you've got infinitesimally small probabilities left, because that was 50%, 50%, So the point is that making systems innovate is really hard, because the probability that one bit of the system doesn't want to play ball is really high, or you add the aggregate probabilities together, you've got effectively zero. So therefore, this idea of just getting energy and getting momentum is key. And I may not have mentioned this yet, but one of the key strategies is just finding the people.
Yeah.
So in other words, within any, we spoke about stakeholder groups. Well, if stakeholder groups are include institutions, there are people within institutions, and not everyone within the institution is really aligned, or at that moment focused. Maybe they're distracted again. So at any moment, it's about finding where the energy is, and the energy is with people, typically. So a lot of this is finding the people with the energy and caring sometimes a little less of what is your role? Are you an officer? Are you authorized? And more, do you have energy? And obviously, you need authority to move things forward. But a lot of the time, you're looking for energy. And I think that, again, you mustn't overlook energy by trying to focus on sort of where the theoretical power is.
I think there's a common theme of, especially around member organizations, of passive support. So, people you refer to as, they don't want to engage this week. And then the active contributors, maybe the company that's always at the events, always joining in. What do you see as, have you undergone any changes that unlocked the less kind of active contributors? You mentioned earlier quite a few ideas, but yeah, just
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. So, for instance, within the world of plus X innovation, so you've got essentially a kind of a co-working office space, and as I've indicated, you do everything from individual freelancers to 20 or 50, or actually on the top floor with the body shop, we've got a 180 person, 200 person organization. Now, it's pretty straightforwardly understood that a sort of 200 person organization is going to be more introspective and looking inwards because they've got an awful lot of resources, compared with a 1 or 3 or 5 person organization that's going to be looking outwards because by definition they just don't have the knowledge or the resources internally. And yet, from a commercial point of view, so if we're coming back to the membership organization, the big organizations drive more revenue for us as a sort of an office-based, sort of space-based business than the freelancer on a desk for £150 a month. And so absolutely, if you look at it from cold, hard commercial points of view, we've got all the engagement from the small people, the smaller entities who don't drive as much revenue, and less engagement, let's say, from the bigger entities. What do? You have to say, I need to go and speak to the bigger entities and say, you're not turning up to these events. Clearly we're not providing something of value, or so it may be an awareness thing where please turn up and you'll see that it's fantastic for you. So sometimes there's a gap between understanding and engagement, but often, of course, maybe the solution is wrong. And so therefore we have to go and speak to them. We have to understand them and say, okay, well, what would work? Okay. And then you're doing a classic customer discovery process and you're trying to create a new product or a new service that will better serve these bigger entities. And that's where, for instance, things like, the sort of the peer-to-peer chief executive thing, leader circle would work. So I think that's, or in that case, you'd say, yeah, okay, you're the leader, you're very busy, but what can we do to make your team feel that they're getting value? Yeah, it's customer-centered design and segmenting your population, and ultimately understanding, do you have engagement appropriately from all of your customers? Do you need to do more to understand how to better meet the needs of some segment of your customer?
I think it's a really interesting point, and I think focusing on the smaller kind of, as you say, the hot deskers, one of the issues we're seeing there a lot is economic downturn, the cost of living, etc., which is going to impact those smaller people more. Are you going to pay to be part of a member organization? Whereas if you're part of the body shop, they'll pay and you don't as an individual. So have you seen any kind of strategies that have helped navigate those economic kind of issues and the uncertainty that we're all experiencing at the moment, that A, drive engagement, but B, kind of really keep the organization moving forward, still listening to, as you say, both of those types of organizations?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I must admit, because I suppose I left the business 3 months ago, I can't speak to some of the things that have happened as we've continued to have that sort of difficult economic context in the UK. What I can speak about, I suppose, is what happened 5 years ago, which was interesting, in that we launched hubs at a moment of lockdown. So, of course, the lockdown was particularly difficult for many businesses for different reasons, but focusing specifically on the smaller businesses. Many of them were not only, let's say, having, in quotes, a hard time with an existing business model, but perhaps their business model had been completely blown up by the pandemic. Maybe they were in events. We had some people who were part of the time who were in event sort of catering, completely blown up by the lockdowns. And in that context, what was really interesting was actually what happened on a peer-to-peer basis, that people were really using each other, firstly, as a sort of psychological support system. Times were tough, and actually being surrounded by people who were also in a tough situation, willing to talk about it, just made you feel you were less alone. And so it must never be underestimated, actually, the power of these communities in providing peer-to-peer psychological support. But then secondly, people were sometimes having to pivot, and so they had a kind of sounding board for all of that. And sometimes you'd have some trading where someone would say, okay, I'll help you out. And so those were just sort of 3 examples of the forms of peer-to-peer exchange that were happening at the time. In theory, you could end up with sort of slightly different solutions. I mean, a lot has been spoken about and done in some ways around the role of government in acting as a procurer of services. So what's happened historically, of course, is that governments which are big typically have procured services from suppliers who are big, because there's a sense of kind of, again, it's simpler for the government. We spoke about the centre needing things simple. Perhaps it feels reliable. You've got a track record. I feel that your cash flow is good, your economics, and so therefore you're not going to go bust. So there's loads of reasons why naturally the centre of a big entity would want suppliers who are big. But of course, that squeezes out the opportunity for government to procure the services from small and medium-sized businesses. And so there's been a lot of work done to try and make sure that both national and local government procure services. And again, that's sort of where an entity like us could sort of help to broker perhaps, and sort of say, okay, local government, come in, consult with these groups of people. And that's a slightly longer play. But I think there are ways. But it's always challenging, right? In difficult economic times, as we all know, it's hard to magic up business. But ultimately, be it peer-to-peer or kind of matching the big and the small, these are some of the ways in which you can begin to minimize some of the negative effects.
Thanks, Matt. And I think kind of looking forward now, you've gone through all of the these various fantastic organizations. You're on a new kind of phase of knowledge reflection and exploration. What are your big questions, and also your kind of areas of focus around engagement, and specifically around ecosystems and communities going forward?
Yeah, well, of course, as you might imagine, one of the answers has to be around AI. So I just spent the last 6 weeks doing some executive education at Imperial College Business School around AI for business innovation. And one of the things, because in our innovation hubs, of course, I'd be meeting loads of interesting entrepreneurs. One of the things that was increasingly happening, and also in public discourse over the past sort of years and months, was people saying, I'm making an AI first law firm or whatever, right? And I kind of went, oh, that's interesting. What is an AI first? So I thought to myself, what is an AI first approach to ecosystems? And so I started to sort of try to begin to develop sort of what might be called digital twins in some ways. I suppose if an ecosystem is essentially, in a physical sense, a group of institutions and people that are trying to connect with one another, share knowledge, create impact, create more jobs, perhaps raise investment, that's a sort of an intermediate impact, improve productivity. How might we use generative AI to almost work in the background, be it to do with making suggestions of how to better connect the bits of the ecosystem together to find those opportunities? Because perhaps it's got a scale, the ecosystem is a scale that I can't keep in my head every moment. It's actually to sort of chuck out, hey, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? And to spot those patterns, that might be good. But equally, measuring impact. So one of the things that also is really important in ecosystems is to say, well, yeah, what has a positive effect? But there's a real problem within ecosystems of so often you might do something and then the effect plays out over time, especially if what we're doing is we're trying to help these businesses to grow, to recruit, to raise money. It may take 3 to 5 years suddenly for them to take off and be recruiting hundreds of people. Well, we've probably moved on to the new project and we're not still in touch with them. So in our particular ecosystem, according to our definitions of success, there might be a really interesting role for generative AI as a digital twin to be overseeing and assisting this sort of gardening of this amazing, emergent ecosystem. So I certainly am thinking an awful lot about that. But then, of course, I'm always on the lookout trying to understand how the context is shifting. So again, in my ecosystems where I'm still very passionate about place-based innovation ecosystems, what's happening in terms of government priorities, in terms of local government, where are the innovation challenges thematically, and an awful lot more in terms of cybersecurity and defense, perhaps. What's happening in terms of local leadership? We're seeing a much more devolved government, but I think that's probably not. It's becoming quite distracted. Some places are being distracted because they're in the process of change, and some people are probably more. Some places they are now changed. So they've got the power. So I'm sort of thinking both about, I'm sort of still thinking about that systems level and trying to work out how best I can play, be it in a particular geography, or thinking hard about digital platforms that truly do manage to connect all these various parts together. Because as I spoke about before, how you connect the leadership of the membership organizations and the members is a complex thing. And there may be a role for generative AI in not automating stuff, because I think that's that's where people have misunderstood what this type of AI is good at. But I certainly think in terms of throwing up ideas and opportunities, the seeds of ideas, I think these systems could be quite powerful.
I think that's really interesting. And in your work with AI, what you were just talking about there, of the collaborative ecosystems and the twinning, have you kind of seen any key success factors about delivering value and impact that it's kind of thrown up that you can, because of your experience? And I think, again, that's the thing with AI, isn't it? If you're just asking it questions, you're not going to get anything back. But if you're then analyzing it with your own experience, things that you've seen and said, yeah, I have seen that work, I do know that works.
Yeah, I mean, I think with all of these things, I would always start with, when you're building out a system, you have to work out which bit of the system shall I deliver first, because and this is often the mistake made when people are thinking about ecosystems. They're so busy imagining, look, in the future, it'll be this all singing, all dancing thing. Yeah, but that's going to take you 5 years to build that. Is there a bit of the system that even tomorrow, if you could build it, even though you don't have the network effect of all of the rest of the system, would this one bit work by itself? Mm-hmm. And in that context, I think in the types of ecosystems I'm dealing with, I think this impact thing would be useful, because I think impact is always a very resource intensive thing to manage, because at the moment it's sort of, I don't know, emailing a company after a year of, and saying, how many people have you recruited this year? And you don't get an answer, because it's, so at the moment it's incredibly manual, very low success rate, don't get many replies to your emails. And so therefore you don't get a lot of result. And at the same time, an awful lot of public funding wants to see that impact. And so that struck me as a particular bit you might break off, to look at the real kind of automation of impact measurement, really to capture that. And then if you got that going, would people begin to understand this wider opportunity where some of this kind of, I don't know, suggesting that certain companies get together, or suggesting this is a gap in the ecosystem or something like that, some of the stuff where it sounds interesting, but we're not sure whether it's valuable yet. You'd build that out over time once you'd really shown that this approach could really work for that immediate need.
I'm going to start wrapping things up, Matt, but I think you're a very interesting speaker in terms of the fact that you have led organizations, you've founded organizations, you are a member, you're part of boards with, River and stuff like that. So you do have a kind of full spectrum of ideas. Could you just kind of list through what you see from, specifically from a member position and on the board, of what are the biggest challenges for member organizations, specifically in these uncertain times? Because I think that is the crucial thing and the reason for this forum.
Yes. I think that with member organizations, I suppose part of it, I can imagine, is around, it depends on the type of memberships, but obviously when one goes through a difficult economic cycle, there can be a sense of sort of losing members. And ultimately, one of the things we've often reflected on with PlusX Innovation is that sense of how do you maybe allow for people to drop down in a form of membership, just to sort of maintain that connection, so that then they could go up in the future. So sometimes being inventive around the economics and having to sort of accept almost that sticking to your current model and its membership or nothing may cause you to lose people. So there's a real subtle judgment call around where does hanging on to a relationship matter because it'll flourish in the future, versus essentially saying, actually, this particular member is increasingly not aligned with our vision, and so therefore hanging on has no value, because ultimately I think we both want to go our separate ways. So I think that sort of economic relationship is important. But as I say, I think finding sometimes lower cost ways to do things, I think what's been really interesting, let's say PlusX Innovation is a good example, was we went through an era when the UK was part of the EU of having large EU funded programs. Fabulous in many ways, but the governance and management and reporting overheads were enormous. And we can have a debate about efficiency and bureaucracy. But ultimately, I think what I've heard from the team coming out of it is that actually having a smaller budget isn't necessarily a bad thing. And that sometimes you can get rid of an awful lot of, barnacles on the boat, as the politicians refer to it, an awful lot of things that weren't actually necessary. And actually you can kind of make much leaner the things you want to do. And sometimes, as I was indicating earlier on with supermarkets and the World Wide Web, sometimes it's about self-service or peer-to-peer. So again, I think using the economic challenge as a way to bust certain myths about how much you should spend on things, and does a cheaper service really mean a worse service? I think sort of breaking that mindset, I think, is also really important. Sometimes, as I say, it could be about searching for new types of stakeholders. Maybe there is a group of people who will bring fresh energy and fresh blood into things. And maybe, it depends on the type of member organization, but maybe you've slightly narrowed your sense of what you're doing and who your stakeholders are. And actually, maybe you need to open up again and say, look, this is still my mission. This is still my mission, but maybe a new group of people are now interested to engage. So those are some of the things I can think of about that. But overall, I think it's this governance thing which is hardest. And we know this in terms of innovation and organizations, doesn't matter whether a business or a charity or government, that have existed for a long time. So any entity that has an existing sort of governance and business model that's thinking about innovating, in the professional world of innovation, I suppose we talk about incremental things or evolutionary things and then disruptive things. And sometimes, that word disruptive is bandied around a lot. But a disruptive innovation is one that sort of makes you wince because you think to yourself, it's hurting my ability to sort of make my current economic model work. And those are very challenging from a governance point of view. And when I spoke about YouTube, what could I learn from someone else? What could I learn from YouTube or Tesco's or Google or whatever, Uber? It's a classic brainstorming technique. What if brand X that I consider to be completely different from me, what if they were running my organization? What changes would they make? So I think sometimes when trying to imagine different cultural values and different governance systems, it's not that you would necessarily adopt the governance practices and brand promises of Tesco's, but you would just look at the world through their lens, just to see how different the world could look, to shake you out of your current worldview. So I do think understanding things from your members' point of view, but imagining yourself to be a complete, heretical stuff. What would Elon Musk do? And using that as a knock to the head, irrespective of what you think about the politics and the ethics of those people. So I think knocking yourself on the head is remarkably hard, but is useful even as a thinking exercise, just to shake yourself out of your current worldview that may have become a little bit overly fixed and lacking a sense of flexibility and dynamism.
In terms of what drew you to be part of the Stakeholder Impact Forum, is that in line with that? And do you see this kind of forum network in supporting that, of sharing ideas and bringing disruptive ideas to find different ways of working?
Absolutely. One thing maybe I haven't said is that what was amazing about my first job working at IDEO, where I started off as an intern and became a partner, was that we were working for just about every industry there was. And I would be designing healthcare one minute and office products the next and consumer products the next. And the point is that ideas really can be stolen and move between industries. And so I think for me, what's exciting about something like a members impact forum is that you've got a common approach, which is membership, but you're probably in very different sectors with very different contexts. And so this idea of a commonality of worldview and yet differences, and perhaps the common desire to innovate, to just improve things, to make things better, means that actually there's a nice mix there. You never want a group to be overly competitive because they won't share information, or to have no linkage, and actually just this feels like a really interesting group that's just got the right amount of common purpose, but at the same time, different worldviews that could be shared. So I think that's what's interesting about a group like this.
Fantastic. And very final question is, you mentioned a lot of challenges there. If you could pose one key challenge to the other leaders and experts involved in the Stakeholder Impact Forum, something which, as you say, in a different sector, they might have already solved, what is that one, nugget that you're really looking to discover?
I think my one challenge would be about this thinking differently. Just because you're in your particular sector doesn't mean that an idea from another sector might not be relevant. I remember with especially the Design Council trying to prove this value of this human-centered creative approach, logistics companies were going, no, that's for kind of perfume and computers. Design isn't for us. And then did some amazing work on service design and branding for logistics company. And they went, oh my God, why didn't we see this? So I think, just think beyond, try to be open to ideas that may be from a sector that you don't think are relevant to you. Because I think there's also a bit of a hierarchy sometimes. Well, we're much more technical than they are, So I think that there's always a slight hierarchy to ideas. So one of the things we often talk is have a beginner's mindset, bit of humility. It's only just about sort of thinking. So just for a moment, think different. Just get inspired by places which you don't think have got anything to teach you. We had doctors connecting with Formula One pit crews. That's an interesting one. Operating theatres and Formula One pit crews. Just switch off that critical faculty that sort of says, I can't learn anything from you. I think be open-minded, have a beginner's mindset. I think for me, and more than that, if things begin to feel like they might disrupt you, again, find ways to have those thoughts or practical experiments that allow you to explore that space. Because again, many entities don't move forward because they're resistive to change because they fear some aspect of it. But ultimately, change is happening whether you want it to or not. Think differently and allow for a certain level of disruption, even though completely understand that you can't kind of cause chaos as Elon Musk tends to do.
In the conclusion, if in doubt, ask a student or pretend to be Elon Musk. Fantastic.
Yeah, and who knows, maybe assistive dogs could help you in your mission.
Or pit crews. Thank you so much, Matt. I really appreciate you taking the time and bringing so many fantastic solutions and ideas.
Thanks, Jonathan. Great to talk to you.